start my messages off with something a little bit lighthearted. And I heard about this husband and wife that argued every single morning about whose job it was to make the coffee. The husband just insisted that it was the wife's duty to make the coffee, and she just argued as strongly back that it was the husband's job to make the coffee. They argued about this for weeks and weeks, and it really just kind of became this kind of source of tension between the two of them. When finally the wife says, you know what? I can prove once and for all that it's the man's job to make the coffee, and I can prove it to you using the Bible. He laughed and laughed, and he said, what are you talking about? There's nothing in the Bible that says it's the man's job to make the coffee. She grabbed her Bible and quickly opened it to the book of Hebrews. That one maybe wasn't my best. Grace and peace to you from God the Father and from our Lord and from our Savior Jesus, who is the Christ. Amen. This morning we wrap up our sermon series on faith and football entitled Lessons from the Gridiron. We spent the last 5 weeks trying to learn lessons that we see out on the football field and then relate them to what we learn from God's Word and our faith in order to ground ourselves further in God's truth. The first week we talked about no pain, no gain. That sometimes you really have to roll your sleeves up in life, and it's the same with our faith. That if we want a deeper connection with God, we got to put work into it. We can't just expect God to do all the heavy lifting for us. When it comes to faith and our walk with Jesus Christ, we have to put that effort in. The second week we looked at the 12th man. The 12th man is typically used to describe the stadium full of people cheering on their team. And we talked about as Christians in this world, we're all on the same team. It doesn't matter if we're Lutheran, Presbyterian, Catholic, whatever denomination, we're all working at this together, trying to bring God's kingdom into our world. We looked at a few lessons from legendary coaches. And then last week we looked at the agony of defeat. And we talked about how life is filled with setbacks. Life is filled with hardships. And you cannot avoid hardship. And then last week we ended with looking at Jesus on the cross. And if you remember, we talked about how the greatest defeats that this world thought they'd ever seen was on Good Friday. As Jesus went to the cross, it was a deep, dark, somber day. And yet we saw that from the cross, Jesus was risen on Easter morning. We talked about how even in the darkest moments, even in the worst situations in life, God has a way of bringing something good from it. As we look back at last week's message, you remember when Jesus was risen from the grave and he shows himself to the disciples in the upper room. And how are they ultimately convinced that it really is the risen Lord? He shows them his hands, right? And he shows them the hole in his side. And sometimes I've wondered, when God was able to raise Jesus from the dead, he was able to somehow take a man who was dead, bring him back to life, reform him, bring him back onto this earth. Have you ever stopped and wondered, why did God not fix the holes in Jesus' hands? If God rose Jesus from the grave, why not heal those as well? I think God did it for a specific reason. Jesus still has those holes in his hands. They're not symbols of defeat. They are symbols of hardship, but they are the symbols of his victory. They are the story of how he overcame death. And I think for us, our darkest moments, the trials that we go through, often they leave scars in us as well, right? Maybe not physical scars, although sometimes we have physical scars from some type of physical ailment that we've gone through, but those emotional scars. I did a funeral this last Wednesday. A woman lost a husband who was 62 years old, died too soon. And we talked about how that loss will never go away, and it'll be there the rest of her life, and yet God will walk with her. And then God made a promise to her husband. That scar is still there, and yet that scar can be a symbol of God walking with you through those moments. Well, this morning I want to talk to you about what victory looks like. How do we define victory in this life? And ultimately, how does God look at what a victorious life looks like in and through us? Now, when it comes to football, it's very clear, isn't it? At the end of the game, whoever has more points on the scoreboard wins the game. Now, if you're a football coach, there's all kinds of different things that they might look for that they want to happen. You may want to win the turnover margins. You don't want to fumble the ball or throw interceptions. You'll often hear a coach say, if we have less turnovers than the other team, we should win the game. The key word being should. Sometimes it happens, but it doesn't always happen. Or sometimes you hear a coach about, we really need to run the football and control the line of scrimmage. It's a key point, but it doesn't always end up to winning the football game at the end of the day. This is probably the one thing that we'll look at in these 5 weeks. When it comes to the game of football, does not always translate equally into our lives. If I were to ask you, are you winning the game of life right now? Would you be able to put up a scoreboard? This isn't easy for us to do, is it? Would you be down a touchdown? Would you be up 2 touchdowns? What's the score of your life look right now? It's not as clear as it is in the game of football. Now, there's all kinds of different ways that we measure success in life. And I want to talk to you about what God sees as true success and how the rest of the world typically measures success. Raise your hand if you've ever been on Facebook. We got a lot of Facebook users here. It's about half the congregation. Now, when you post things on Facebook, what are you hoping to have done? You want to get people to like it, right? You want to have people smile. You want to have people comment on it. And sometimes people describe whether or not they're successful in life by how many likes they have on Facebook or how many friends they have on Facebook. But is that truly being victorious in life? Or the workplace. How do you describe being victorious in the workplace? Whether or not you're promoted, whether or not your coworkers look up to you, whether or not you've been given raises, or if you're a salesperson, how many sales you've received in that year. The workplace, there's all kinds of different ways to measure being victorious. Students, I see Gabriel back there. Gabriel's getting to the age now where it's very clear when you're a student whether or not you're victorious or not. Comes down to GPA, right, Gabriel? The higher the GPA is, the more victorious you are in school. And when students get older, they look at things like the SAT and the ACT. Pastor, when I get together with my colleagues, believe it or not, you would think we talk about some very deep things, and sometimes we do, but when we get together, the number one thing we always talk about, how many people did you have in church worship attendance this last Sunday? Now, are these things that we often measure, that we often think as measurements to being victorious in life, are they the true standard? Are they what God really looks at our lives, declaring us victorious or not? Now, I'm a coach. I'm not a high school football coach. I'm not even a football coach. I like football, but I don't know enough about football to get myself into it. But I love baseball. And so I've got 2 little boys, and they play games, and there's a score at the end of it. But in all honesty, what I am most concerned about is that time that I get to spend with my 2 boys. That's going out to the ballpark. I love it. And what I describe as victorious with my time with them is not whether or not they win or they lose. Don't get me wrong, we want to win. We like winning. But those victorious moments is that time that I get to spend with them. It's not about the scoreboard. It's spending those moments two children. And our gospel message for this morning, we have the 12 disciples. And these 12 disciples are with Jesus, and they believe that Jesus will one day be the King of Israel. They think that one day he will sit on the throne and he will remove the Roman oppressors and he will reestablish God's kingdom of Israel right there in Jerusalem. And the 12 disciples start bickering and start fighting about which of the 12 is Jesus' favorites. Which of the 12 are the number 2 and the number 3 in command? I can just see them, right? Peter and Matthew and John and James, and they're all arguing, they're all fighting, trying to say why they are most deserving. They're arguing to sit at Jesus' right hand and at his left hand. In essence, they're arguing for when Jesus becomes king, they want to be vice presidents and secretary of state. They are jockeying for power and his perceived kingdom that Jesus is about to usher in. And I love the gospel reading for this morning because we have James and John and their way of trying to get power. Did you catch this? Who they send in to argue for them? James and John send their mommy to Jesus. And James and John's mommy starts saying, "Have you seen my 2 sons? Boy, they're good, aren't they? They're fishermen. They own a business. And, fishermen are nice and strong. And can't you see how handsome they are? And Jesus, when you become king, why don't you pick them? Look at my sons, James and John." Jesus responds, "You don't know what you're asking. First, it's not my position to grant those seats of authority. It's God the Father's. And secondly, are they able to drink from the cup that I'm about to drink?" And Jesus gives us some truths. To be great, to be mighty in God's eyes, and to be truly great in this life, it's not about the likes on Facebook. It's not about the number of sales you have as a salesperson. It's not about the number of promotions that you make or anything else that this world typically tells you you're great doing. Greatness comes in serving. Greatness comes from taking the things that you're good at, your gifts, your abilities, and sharing them with others. Taking the things that God has blessed you with them and giving them away to the rest of the world. I'm going to close this morning's message with a Pittsburgh Steeler. Everybody recognize the running back up here, the greatest running back in Pittsburgh Steelers history, Jerome the Bus Bettis. You remember this guy? This guy was a bruising running back. He played for the Steelers from 96 to 2005. He won the Steelers a Super Bowl champion. When he retired in 2006, he had the 5th most rushing yards in all of NFL history. Not just the Steelers, all of NFL history. I love this picture. This really gets his character in essence. This big, bad, bruising running back that was a champion. However, this is only part of Jerome Bettis' story. Another part of his life that you may not know about him is his work in his community. This is Jerome Bettis and his foundation. His foundation is called the Bus Stops Here Foundation. And in 2001, the NFL awarded him the Walter Payton Man of the Year Award for his work in the Pittsburgh community. They only give one player this award every single season. And what Jerome Bettis does in Pittsburgh, he raises funds to help the kids in the inner cities. He organizes bowling for the kids to have some type of outreach to do. He gathers Christmas gifts to give to needy children in the community. His whole foundation is based upon lifting up the kids in Pittsburgh that the rest of the community and the world seems to forget about. Now I wonder, when Jerome the Bus Bettis breathes his last and he sees God face to face for the very first time, do you think God will sit down with him and want to talk about his NFL glory days, or do you think God will be more interested in this type of work? What is success in this life? What is being victorious in this life? Now, Jerome Bettis had a big platform. He was able to use his success as a running back to do great things in this life, things that myself and you aren't able to do because we're not Jerome the Bus Bettis. And yet all of us have our own people in this world. All of us have our own platforms. All of us have our own abilities to make a difference. Do you want to be victorious in life? What are you doing to giving yourself away? How are you being a servant? How are you loving? How are you lifting up those that are forgotten? How are you making this world a better place? Let's be victorious. Let's follow Christ. Let's follow in Jesus' footsteps, being a servant.